The month of February 1990 was an important watershed for African political development. In many ways, it was reminiscent of the onset of independence in the 1950s and 60s. First, in the West African country of Benin, a series of popular protests against the corrupt dictator of 17 years, Matthew Kerekou, ushered in a national conference that ousted him from power and ultimately led to the establishment of a new democratic government.
An event leading to democratic transition in Benin and its effects on the spread of democracy in Africa as a whole. So that question is a very important one for me because it's very personal. You know, like I was a political activist. I started basically organizing students for democracy, for freedom since I was in 11th grade, and I was arrested several times. And on May 6, 1984, we organized a major protests. And from then, student protests in the country. From then, things were never the same. So the government, the dictatorship, the Kerekou dictatorship was fragilized, and many of us were arrested, and there was some kind of international outcry against the repression in Benin. And also, since Benin is known to be, the epicenter, I should say, of activism, especially student activism in Francophone West Africa since the colonial times. So the news spread, and then as a result, there was a push for a national conference. And then the national conference led to a transition government and to election in 91. So because of, the reputation of Benin, and because also the fact that, Francophone countries still act more or less as a bloc, the experience of Benin spread in other countries, like Togo and Cameroon in particular, and many other countries, and Niger and Mali and so on. And as a result of this, you have push for democratic transition all across Africa. So I cannot say with strong evidence that there is a direct effect of what's happened in Benin and what happened in other Anglophone countries, particularly Ghana. But at least in the Francophone countries, Benin was, played a leading role, and there is some kind of contagion effect, clearly, in what's happened. And what is interesting is the method, is how it happens, And I hope, and I think we don't sort of study that enough, because it's it was a very conflictual situation that could lead to major crises and conflict, even violent conflict. But then the political leader decided to have some kind of convention, some kind of a large gathering of all the political groups to figure out what the solution. They even invited the dictator, and those who are in power, the military, the religious leaders, to figure out the way forward. And that's helped to sort of reset the clock in terms of creating new political parties and write the constitutions. And this has led to a very smooth transition out of dictatorship, where the dictator knew that he was safe, that he is not going to be prosecuted so long as he accepts the election results. And it allowed people living abroad to come to the country and to participate in the political process, to create some time where people sort of refresh a little bit and try to figure out what kind of institutions are needed, for the country to go forward. And I think it was an extremely important movement. And I can say that this started from the student movement from early 80s. And I'm very, very happy to have been part of it. And even today, people refer to that time and say, you are doing this, it's not in line with the decision of the National Conference. You are doing that, this is in line with the decision of the National Conference. So it's still a very important moment in the history of a place. And I hope it's something that is sort of written about enough so that this model of transition, this way of conducting transition of dictatorship is something that can be applied elsewhere.
In Ghana, citizens also stood up to advance democratic rule.
So Ghana made a transition to democracy in '92. So we've been more than 20 years, 24 years. Next year, January, will be the 25th anniversary of transition to democracy. And this was the fourth attempt since we gained independence. And this is also the one that has lasted. In all the previous attempts, they were overthrown by military regimes. And so we take pride in ourselves that we've been able to at least experiment with this form of government for 25 years, close to 25 years. And I think there's no turning back, because again, if you go to Afrobarometer surveys, Ghanaians' preference and support for democracy has been high, ranging between 70 to 80% over the last few years that Afrobarometer has been on.
And in South Africa, on February 2, 1990, after decades of resistance, in a speech to the white South African Parliament, State President F.W. de Klerk announced that country's historic opening to a democratic, multiracial society.
The prohibition of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, and a number of subsidiary organizations is being rescinded.
And just a few days later, the world would watch as Nelson Mandela, who had served 27 years in prison, walked as a free man.
There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa.
And in April 1994, South Africans went to the polls in an historic election, one that was largely peaceful, and that from the perspective of the 1980s, and maybe even the early 1990s, many people thought would never be possible.
Some signs began to show that this government was crumbling. The international pressure was really on for change, and we had a semblance that things might happen. I think with the release of Mandela, the unbanning of political organizations, we then knew that we were going to really have fundamental change in South Africa. So we were preparing ourselves. For me, the success story is about, and it's truly a miracle of how just days before the election, people, the whole of South Africa, were really in a tense state. People of all communities, all different walks of life, were so really caught up with the fear of the unknown. What will democracy bring? Would it be like some parts of Africa or Europe, or where things go haywire? And we all got up day after elections on that fateful April day. And the sun rose, things were normal, people walked about, and suddenly it was a huge sigh of relief for all South Africans that we've crossed the Rubicon, we've done the big change. And Nelson Mandela was phenomenal, and the ANC's victory was really celebrated by all Democrats and progressive people. And for me, that the social cohesion and the nation building that Madiba and the ANC embarked on was absolutely phenomenal. From being arch rivals, where people hated each other, to become a welded, solid nation was really a miracle that we can talk about.
So why did it take so long for South Africa to open up its political system to allow democracy for all people, irrespective of the color of their skin? Adam Habib provides a few insights.
Local elections, democratic institutions, the rule of law at one level. It simply stopped at white South Africa and wasn't allowed to extend elsewhere. So I think the first big reason why democratic traditions were subverted was both the colonialism coupled with the racial project. And it's that combination that subverted it in South Africa, but subverted it in sub-Saharan Africa for much of that period. It is only when, post the Second World War, when nationalist movements begin the real struggle against a weakened colonial state, and as the segregatory impulses begin to fracture, that the democratic traditions emerge.
How and why did we observe these political openings? Was it just a coincidence that all of these countries, long ruled by dictators, were suddenly undergoing major political upheavals? Professor Kassar describes the process and the pressures in Kenya.
So multi-party politics emerges in the 1990s in Kenya through a process that is actually pretty similar to many sort of African countries at the time, though I think less conflictual than in a place like, say, Cameroon, right? So essentially, I would see sort of in addition to things like the fall of the Soviet Union, I would trace, I would say that there's three sources of discontent about the Moi regime in the late 1980s. So protests initially to the regime were initially clerics, Catholic and Protestant clerics start to voice opposition to the regime. In the late 1980s. You also have elite organizations like the Law Society of Kenya, which sort of starts to criticize some of the excesses of the Moi regime in the late 1980s. At the same time, throughout the 80s, you have a decline in economic performance in Kenya that has a number of sources. So declining commodity prices, the fact that interest rates are high. And what this means is the government becomes increasingly more dependent on loans from the World Bank and IMF for budget support, which at the very time where major international donors are much less willing to tolerate governments that are autocratic. And so one lever that the IFIs had against the Moi government was access to loans. And one of the events that happens just prior to Moi's decision in 1991 to open up party politics is this a suspension of loans by the IMF. And at the same time, you also see sort of elite splits. So the first, as in many other cases, the first politicians who are willing to say that they're going to agitate for multi-party politics are sort of former, are these two Kikuyu politicians, Kenneth Matiba and Charles Rubia, who say that who say in 1990 that they're going to contest for multi-party politics. And one of the big events that occurs around this is. One of the biggest sort of catalyzing events, particularly for young people and students, is the way that the Moi regime dealt with these pro-democracy rallies that took place on July 7th, 1990, sort of these Saba Saba protests. And the Moi regime arrests many people, hundreds of people die. Subsequent to that, there are two sort of prominent politicians who meet bad ends. And I think that's another sort of radicalizing event. And essentially, I think Moi agrees in 1991 to introduce multi-party politics because he's reasonably certain that he can manage this process. And if we're thinking about like genuine competitive politics, I would really say that only comes about, certainly after 1997, maybe around 2001, when two things happen. One, it becomes very clear that Moi is not going to be allowed to serve a third term, right? There's some sort of bootlickers in the Kanu government who, tried to get him to do that further, but, it becomes very clear he's going to step down. And once he steps down, that gives other people permission to contest for the presidency, right? And to form coalitions to contest for the presidency. That's the first thing. And then the second thing that happens is that, and in fact that's the main thing. The second thing that happens is I think economic liberalization basically reduces the reach of the state. And so the government's capacity to punish people for voting with the opposition or for supporting opposition politicians declines somewhat. But I think the start of truly competitive politics is the 2002 election.
Well, clearly it wasn't just a coincidence. In fact, several important forces really came together at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s that led to this wave of democratization. It was a mix of ideas, economic pressures, and political mobilization.